Hi, everybody. Thank you all for coming. Also noticed a number of my former colleagues at ComScore are on the line. Glad you guys are aboard. Feel free to tease me relentlessly at some later point. Tamara's going to be clicking the clicker, so every so often I'll tell her to click. And let's begin. So the first thing we're going to talk about is just the challenge that everybody already knows, and that is that what advertisers and marketers are trying to do is to correctly identify their prospects when they're doing their advertising. And primarily that's being done either with demos alone or demos in a small set of other factors, maybe behavioral, maybe psychographic. But it's a challenge. What we've been doing is looking at the really large range of psychographics at our disposal at Simmons Research and seeing, is there a way to allow the data to take us there so that we can zero in much more efficiently on the best audience for a brand or a media property. Go ahead. So this is marketing 101, but if you want to scale your business, you don't want to waste your ad dollars hitting the entire universe. You want to hit your target. And what we're going to talk about is sort of the step forward in measurement that we're going to be describing is the ability to most accurately hit the people who aren't using your product, but are the highest likelihood to use your product. And that's different in a very significant way from the typical assumption that the people who use your brand are the kinds of people you want to reach. There may be people that don't look like the people who use your brand, but who would, and we want to help you find them. Go ahead. So the solution, we've called this Predictive Consumer Insights, and essentially what it is it's a data mining procedure that allows you to go through the nearly 600 Simmons psychographic attributes in the NCS, the National Consumer Survey, which is a probabilistic survey hitting about 25,000 consumers a year. It's a survey that's so long and contains so many data points that if you were to give it to prisoners, it might be considered a war crime. In addition to that, we have the 265 driver tags, which are from RMT. Those are essentially psychographics related to show choice, to how you choose what kinds of shows you might want to consume. We then focus specifically on the variables that are predictive of brand or media choice. We use the 95% confidence level. And then the most important thing is that we're able to score every respondent in the NCS on their likelihood to use a brand or watch the programming. And this approach is more than 250% the predictive power in targeting just on demos. And we'll go through that. This is a much simplified version, so stop right there. Much simplified version of the methodology. So right here we're saying, I mentioned we had nearly 600 psychographics. These are just 4 of the groups. When you do this with a full set, it's about 26 groups altogether. But that's way too many variables. If you think about nearly 1,000 predictive variables, it's way too many to construct a statistically valid approach to measure. So what we do is we break those variables down into similar characteristics, attributes with similar characteristics. We either do that because they naturally fall together, like the 4 you see here, which might be environmental psychographics, health, lifestyle, economic, or we have others which don't naturally fall into a group. We use factor analysis to determine what would go with what. And then what we do is we run those models independently. So in the first, in that blue box, you've got demos plus the 25 environmental psychographics. These numbers aren't correct, by the way, just so you know. We have different numbers of these. The red box, demos plus the 31 health psychographics, demos plus the lifestyle, demos plus the economic psychographics. And what we do is from there, we pull out only the variables that matter. So we exclude anything that's collinear, meaning 2 things that are really basically the same thing, and anything that doesn't significantly affect the model. So go ahead and click. And so from there, you dilute it down. And again, in this much simplified model, we go down from over 100 variables, just down now to 35 variables, and that's nine survive from the environmental psychographic, 6 from health, 12 from lifestyle, 8 from economic. You can kind of think about this as the way you would think about, the March Madness, right? You're just going down and down and down to the most effective of the groups. Then you take what remains and you put that into a model. And you go through the process again, and you find out which of these really matter. And then from here, go ahead and click. We end up with a final model where you would say 6 environmental, 5 health, 9 lifestyle, 4 economic. So that's a total of 24 psychographic variables out of the roughly 100 at the top make the cut and are the strongest predictors. And then from here, you can figure out what percentage of the variance is explained by this final model versus if you had just run it with the demos alone. Demography is used in every model because those are important control variables. I'm happy to talk about that in questions if anybody has questions about how the models work. Go ahead to the next slide. So what's the improvement? If you were to run these models, and we ran them on about 2,700 brands, we're in the process of increasing that number up. We expect it to go up another 1,000 or more brands. But if you look at just these 2,700 or so brands, on average, demos predict about 5.5% of the variance. That means that 5.6% of what goes into the decision to be a brand user or to be a show watcher. In this case, a brand can be a show as well. It's explained by 5.6%, which means that over 94% of what goes on is unexplained. It happens, it's other stuff in the world. And it's interesting to look at this because that is overwhelmingly what marketers use to try to identify their folks. It's not that it's bad or that it doesn't work, it's just not terribly efficient. When we include the psychographics, we end up with more than twofold gain in predictive power. So if you look at this, we're now explaining almost 15% of the variance when we include all the demos. So 9.2% of the variance coming from psychos, 5.6 coming from demos. Go ahead to the next slide. We also broke this down by some brand categories. We didn't use them all, but we used a number of the larger ones and more important ones. Alcohol's in here just because we used an alcohol example later in the deck. But what you see is that what we found is across all brand categories, these made a significant and very large impact. You'll notice that the largest impact here is among TV shows, and that's not terribly surprising. It's being driven by, to an extent, by the driver tags, which, because they are psychographics related to show watching, it's not surprising that those are doing a especially good job there. Go ahead to the next slide. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take you through several use cases. My colleague is going to take you through the first two, and then I'll come back to the third and show you what you can do with this and why they're important. So Tamara, all yours.
All right, great. Thank you. That was a great tee up. So as Stephen said, the challenge that we're addressing and that we're thinking about with predictive consumer insights is one that we as marketers and researchers are all very familiar with, which is how do you really efficiently and in a scalable way hone in on your best prospects and then activate them and actually find them in a marketplace as well. So the first use case that we wanted to talk through is really all about using what we get out of the process that Stephen just went through and putting that into action, which is something that is completely doable today in our data within the National Consumer Study. It's something that is completely an option and accessible to clients who want to look at a specific target and look at the prospects for that target. So this is really an exercise in, okay, once we've got this target defined, what are some of the different data points that we can pull from in order to build a view around, in this case, media usage and actually being able to come up with a media plan for a specific target. So we're going to start with demos because this is the usual place where we all tend to start. And really, you know, it helps drive home the point that for these 3 retail brands that we are pulling from and using data that we have without even doing any modeling or any of the analysis that Stephen's talked about, we can see quite clearly here that these 3 retailers who are not, you know, big box, large discount retailers, but they kind of sit in that mid-level nationwide kind of discount retailer space. So they are competitors and they are in the same consideration set, and there's a lot of overlap between them in terms of their customer base. So for that reason, it's not too surprising that we're seeing a lot of similarities here, and therefore if we are to build a prospect kind of universe or a prospect target leading with demos, we're going to end up in a place that's pretty murky in terms of really differentiating and knowing that we're reaching people who are really likely to buy from us in the first place. And to put a finer point on it, you know, the other piece here to consider is what the competitive space looks like in terms of how crowded it is, how the distribution of the market falls out. And again, not having done any modeling at this point yet, we can see here that the client brand is the smallest of the 3, followed by competitor 1, and then competitor 2 has a larger part of the market. And then, of course, there are a whole lot of other retailers that are measured, but that may or may not be considered direct competitors. But when we overlay these 3 competitors across each other, what we see is what I alluded to when we were looking at the demos earlier, that there's a lot of overlap here. 64% of people who shop at the client brand are also shopping at least one, if not both, of the competitors. So what Predictive Consumer Insights is doing is really peeling apart, you know, based on what we know about psychographics of current shoppers, who among people who don't currently shop look similar enough to these current shoppers from a psychographic perspective. And then what we're able to do once you imagine we kind of did that whole exercise with these 3 brands and we're focusing now on the client brand, we can develop a target of likely shoppers based on that whole exercise that Stephen had talked about earlier, where we're honing in on the attitudes, the psychographics that really matter for someone to become a shopper. And then we're looking back at everybody else who's not a current shopper, and we're scoring them on the degree to which they actually have that same type of psychographic outlay. And once we've done this, we basically put it in our broader database, and we can run this across any of the other 60,000 variables that we have within our survey, within our studies. And in this instance, we've started by looking at, okay, among people who don't currently shop at our client brand, but we know they're likely to, where else are they shopping? We know they're not shopping with us, but are they shopping at our competitors to any degree? And we certainly see that with competitor 2, a good quarter of them are already shopping there. So again, it's important to kind of keep that in mind and understand who are you trying to peel away from and what are the competitors that are really going to matter in terms of getting your dollars, in terms of getting dollars flowing to you versus flowing to them when they're doing their shopping. So armed with this segment that, as I said, is, you know, sitting within our data now that we've created it through the Predictive Consumer Insights process, what we can do from an advertising media planning perspective is take a look at any of the media data points that we have. And what we usually start with is looking at, okay, overall, from a summary point of view, where are these consumers going? What is their media source of preference? And what we see with our likely brand shoppers, who in this case, we're comparing them to all adults. We could certainly compare them to another target, depending on what we wanted to do. But for right now, we're comparing these likely brand shoppers, this group that we've created, to all adults. And we can see here that magazines are something that might be interesting to dig in on a little bit. Internet is something to dig in on. There's not too much difference there compared to what we see for all adults, but there's certainly quite a bit of volume. And then again, because of the volume and because television as we know it may be changing, but it's still a really important medium and certainly isn't going away, we want to understand what their television preferences are. And on the whole, we have a whole lot of measures where we can take a look at ad receptivity, but we know through one kind of summary measure that we've put together here that this group is more ad receptive than your average consumer. So if you are putting together a media plan and can find them in the right place, they're not the type of consumer who's going to automatically turn up their nose at an ad. So if we start with pushing a little bit further on magazines and where this group is interested from a content perspective, we can start at a high level looking at publication types, and we're talking about places where they over-index above the general population, where there's a fair amount of reach. And we've got women's publications, home and house-related publications, entertainment, health and fitness, and travel. It gets a little bit more interesting, and we can see where it aligns when we've looked at the indices between the general pop and likely brand users at a magazine title level. So here we're looking at magazine titles just within all the data that we have today. We're looking at magazine titles that this particular group is much more likely to read, and it aligns certainly with some of the themes on the general publication types. Now, a lot of this reading, which we can also see by digging into some other data points, is being done digitally by likely brand users. So these are consumers who are, when compared to the average adult, 38% more likely to have used a phone or a tablet magazine app. They're 25% more likely to have visited a magazine website in the past 30 days. So from a digital activation standpoint, even though we're looking at magazines here, this starts to build out a profile of the types of content that this consumer is going to be attracted to and where you're going to see them in higher concentrations if you're to deploy ads in those mediums. So I did say that we were going to look at television because that still is a medium that has wide reach. And this is one place where driver tags can come into play. So as Stephen had mentioned, driver tags are something that we are pulling into the Predictive Consumer Insights process with our partner RMT, because driver tags are basically psychographics that are tied specifically to the types of television that someone watches. So to play this out a little bit, these are the top 3 most powerfully predictive driver tags for our client brand, and are therefore the kinds of driver tags that you want to be thinking about when you're trying to reach prospects. So the strongest one here talks to this idea of sexiness. The second tag here is something that relates to striving for betterment, improving oneself, improving one's situation, what have you. And interestingly enough, for the second one, we see that there's certainly some overlap here in terms of this driver tag having some predictive power for attracting people to the second competitor, but it's much stronger here for the client brand. And all in all, this suggests kind of an interesting opportunity on top of doing a little bit of collaboration with RMT. So when we looked into the types of ads that this particular retailer had been doing and the types of shows that match with this idea of sexiness and are tied to this particular driver tag, we found that there are 9 shows like the ones here, not exactly these, but there are 9 shows that are very much tied to this idea of sexiness and would therefore be a good place for the client to place these ads. Now, on the other hand, this particular retailer does not have any ads that tie into the betterment theme. So if this retailer were to develop an ad campaign around this idea of betterment, there are about 54 different programs that connect with this theme and could help them enhance the ROI of that new commercial. So driver tags to Simmons users are going to be a little bit new, and this is, one way that one can think about using them as they come out of Predictive Consumer Insights. Now, of course, we also have a lot of other ways that we can get to the types of content that this particular segment likes to watch, just like we would any other segment. We can see that this is a group who's interested in news and documentary. It doesn't really show up in their magazine preferences, but they're getting it from somewhere, and it turns out to be partly from television. When we look at their cable networks that they watch, we see some nice alignment here with HGTV, Bravo, Food Network, TLC, with the kinds of magazine content that this group was interested in. So we're really starting to get a clear picture from a media planning standpoint about if we want to reach these prospects, where do we need to put our dollars? And this also goes for digital activation channels. So we can take a look at this particular group, these likely shoppers, and dig into what kinds of activities are they doing on their PC. And this is where home and garden and travel sites tend to index more highly. And what kinds of activities are they doing on their mobile? Here, of course, multimedia is something that's very popular for this group, as well as movies. So with this data in hand and with the capability to basically export this particular segment to another platform that can be used for activation, you can really activate these segments across all sorts of addressable TV, display, mobile, what have you. So this, is just the beginning, but I know it's really dense, but I hope that this plays out the kinds of things that can be done from a really direct kind of targeting media planning standpoint. Next, we are going to switch gears. We're going to talk about tequila because, as Stephen said, we cover alcohol, and what's a good slide deck without talking about alcohol a little bit, especially when you're presenting with Stephen. But we want to talk about, because the core of Predictive Consumer Insights is psychographics, and because psychographics can be so powerful in helping to really get into the mindset of someone, there's an opportunity to also use this approach for building creative content and messaging. In the same way that you might think of pulling a whole bunch of attitudes and looking at indices, think of this as we're doing all the hard work for you and are just telling you these are the psychographics that matter the most. So starting off again with tequila drinkers, setting the stage a little bit, the client brand is a well-known brand. This particular brand that we're talking about, though, is an extension. It's a product extension. And the other two brands are competitive in the space. These are all sort of mid to high-level brands. Brand one is a newer entrant, relatively speaking. Brand two is pretty well entrenched and a pretty well-known brand in this part of the tequila market. And moreover, not a whole lot of difference across these three brands from a demographic standpoint. So again, the key is going to be hitting the right message to really differentiate what somebody perceives and thinks about when they think about the client's brand. Now, we did this market is obviously looking a little bit just that. And there's also significant overlap among the three brands that we're looking at here. So 59% of people who drink the client brand also drink one of the others. And remember, I said that we have some flexibility in terms of how we actually want to divvy up and get a little bit more specific with a prospect or a likely user segment. So much like we did with retailers, you know, we took this through the Predictive Consumer Insights process. We developed a segment of likely brand users, and then we split up this segment into likely brand users who are currently tequila drinkers, but they don't drink our brand, so they're already in the category, and likely users who are not tequila drinkers yet. It's a much harder sell. So we are going to be looking at people who are likely client drinkers, who are already drinking tequila, but they just don't drink our client's brand. And we can see that, you know, they're already doing a fair amount of drinking of especially competitor 2, and about a fifth of them are already drinking competitor 1. So this is where we're going to get under the hood of PCI a little bit more and kind of talk about what it is that actually builds this segment at the end of the day. Because as Stephen said, we're really bubbling up the attitudes that are the most predictive of whether or not somebody will use that brand, and we're using that to create a prospect target. So in this particular exercise for this particular tequila brand, you know, we fed all of our attitudinal statements and the driver tags into the process that Stephen described. And the end result was about 40 psychographic statements that predict users for this particular tequila brand. Now, some of these psychographics are not going to be a surprise, like the statement, I often drink alcoholic beverages at restaurants, or I like to try new drinks, have the highest predictive power for not only this brand, but for the other 2 brands as well. But there are a number of attitudes here that are really interesting potentially from a creative standpoint, and are really kind of giving us a clue into the mindset of this particular consumer. And we have these statistics here that are used, but not necessary for this kind of creative exercise. But this is just to kind of show that what we get at the end of the day with each of these attitudes is this statistic called an odds ratio, or an adjusted odds ratio, which basically means that someone who agrees with this statement, I often go on long car trips or vacations, is 31% more likely to use the brand. Same thing, you know, someone who agrees that I'm affectionate, passionate, loving, or romantic is 20% more likely to use the brand. So all of the 40 psychographics that are a part of the model for this particular brand have these types of values and help with putting together the target at the end of the day. Now, just to bring back what the end goal is here, we're trying to, in the case of tequila, make a better margarita. And if you think of demographics alone as the only ingredients that are used for this margarita, you're only capturing 2% of what really goes into choosing this particular brand. But if we add in the psychographics, and we include psychographics in that exercise, that data mining exercise that Stephen had talked about, we increase to actually capturing 15% of what goes into choosing this particular brand. So you think about it, now you got this great margarita with this tequila that is 642% better at capturing what actually goes into choosing the brand. So great, you've got this great model, you've got all these psychographics. And if we put it in a little bit of a different perspective and go through and kind of look at, okay, for my brand, you know, these are some of the interesting psychographics that pop to the top that I think really can give me some clues around what might drive a creative campaign. The other side of it, though, is that you've got your competitors. And when we overlay what comes up to the top for you as the client and what comes up to the top for your competitor, what we find in a lot of cases, and what we're certainly finding here, is that, yes, there's going to be a certain amount of overlap, but by and large, the attitudes that are definitive for users of one brand are going to be very different, in some cases nuanced, but still different from the attitudes for your competitor brand. So to put this in a little bit more operational context, so the appreciation of Hispanic culture, in the case of the client, it's news. In the case of competitor, it's sports. But the appreciation for Hispanic culture, enjoying going on long car rides, enjoying eating foreign foods, suggests that to appeal to both of these groups or either of these groups, creative with a sense of a little bit of a sense of adventure, a sense of abandon, a nod to the provenance of tequila also will appeal to both groups. But for the client brand in the blue, these are affectionate, passionate consumers. They may appreciate messaging, and it may feel an opportunity to actually reframe the image of tequila. There's a potential to attract this segment by playing up a new kind of refined side of tequila, ways to enjoy it in thoughtful settings, during romantic meals, during personal milestones that aren't just about, partying with your friends, an event that's around enjoying a serene moment on the vacation of a lifetime with a loved one over a really nicely prepared meal. There's an opportunity to talk about a different way of actually consuming tequila and associating that with your brand. On the other side of things, if you are wanting to make a play for your competitors' users or people who would be likely to use your competitor, you want to look at these attitudes on the right. So these are frank, outspoken consumers. They look for more horsepower in their cars, in their lives, and they're going to appreciate messaging that reflects your brand as an experience enhancer. So this is a group that is probably going to be more interested and seeking thrilling situations that they may need a little help to get the bravado to actually take it on. And this kind of sells an opportunity to build up the brand as such, as something that will transform good experiences into great stories. So, so this is another benefit, another way of using predictive consumer insights to dig into psychographics like we normally would, but really know through PCI, predictive consumer insights, that we're focusing on the ones that matter most. Now, I'm going to hand it back over to Stephen to talk about our third use case here, talking about TV, changes in brand, changes in audience over time.
Thanks, Tamara. I appreciate it. I don't know if anybody else noticed that the top predictor for that brand of tequila was liking to take long drives. And, it's always lovely to see drunk driving take such a front and center stage. I'm sure they'll use it in their advertising. So changes in our program audience. So another way that we can think about psychographics is a different way to think about audience composition and being able to check and see whether audience composition is changing over time. Now, that could be because you're doing an active rebrand. If you think about Carl's Jr. as an example, women in bikini cleaning cars and eating hamburgers to a more family-friendly, dad comes home and stops all the shenanigans kind of thing. And psychographics would be, for example, a way that they could look to see whether or not the composition of their audience is changing, hopefully in a way that sells more burgers. What we're going to focus, though, is thinking about TV shows, serialized shows, and looking at the differences in audience year over year. Go ahead. So we're going to be talking about a show. It's a situation comedy, prime time. It's on a major network that between the 2015-16 and 16-17 seasons saw about a 17% drop in rating points. Right? So we looked at the two time frames, and we did what a normal person would do thinking about these data. They'd say, let's look how the demographics shifted. I'm not going to say a whole lot about this slide other than the shrink in audience appears to be more or less across the board. There's a little pickup here, a little drop off there, but in general, demos aren't dramatically different except in a couple of very specific subsets. And it's not particularly helpful when you think about how to retool the show. So the demographics for this show explain about 7% of the choice in watching this program. when you add the psychographics in, you're now explaining more than 36% of the choice, of the variance that goes into predicting whether or not someone will watch this show. That's over 500%, over a five-fold increase in predictive power. So what's changed when we look at that? Go ahead. So let's look at the top 10 most predictive attitudes that went into the 2015-16 rank. There's a lot more than these. These are just the top 10. I didn't want to kill you with data on the slide. The ones that are in red are negative predictors, meaning that someone who enjoys watching religious television programs is actually significantly less likely to want to watch this show. Everything in black is as you saw previously. So what's striking here is that there's a very big difference in that top 10, right? We've gone from these 10 to only 2 of them remaining in the current model. Love the idea of traveling abroad. I rely on magazines. These are, make more sense if you know the show. We've obviously hidden it. But one thing that I'll bring up here is if you look at number 7, how I spend my time is more important than how much money I make. An interesting fact going in from the 15-16 season to the 16-17 season is that the storytelling was marked, among other things, by a change in the characters going from being sort of absently through their career, not knowing what they want to do, doing poorly financially, to moving into stable jobs. They become successful, they get promotions, there's marriages, there's house buying. So you can see that these shifts are causing, these shifts in the story may be causing changes in the kinds of people who are watching. Go to the next slide. Similarly, you can see that the new ranks, the top 10, it's still loading for me, but the top 10 ranks in 2016-17, they don't overlap greatly with the 2015-16 rank. So there's a variety of things that a show or a brand could do when they think about changes in audience composition and changes in how an audience could be expected to think about the brand, or the attitudes and characteristics of the audience and how those have changed. Those are good ways for you to think about what you might change creatively to bring back an audience or to create an audience. So as characters change, these changes may not be positively associated with the people watching your brand. So you might want to either retool your program, or you might want to think about how you would use your tune-in strategy to attract folks who hadn't watched your shows in the past, but who might be more compelled to watch your show now given the change. Go ahead. So, in summary, Predictive Consumer Insights from Simmons Research provides you with some interesting new tools and ways to let the data speak for themselves. So you don't have to guess what are the most important things to look at. The data will show you. Helps you pinpoint your best and most likely prospects. Gives you a variety of tools to improve media planning. It can help to inform creative and content strategies, and it can help you address changes in your user base over time, or to drive the changes in user base that you're looking for. With that, I'd like to say thank you very much, and we'll take questions.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. This is Dina. If you have any questions, please submit those through the chat box and I'll read through them. To start, first question. Do you find psychographic and targeting differences between likely brand users and current brand users?
Yes, we do. We see there's as you saw in the overlap slide, that Venn diagram with between one brand and its competitor. You do see some overlaps, which you'd expect, but you do see areas within the most likely non-using prospects that are different than in the folks who are using it. And that can provide you an effective toolbook creatively and also in terms of looking to see where potential audience for your brand is that you're not currently advertising against.
Next question. How is the psychographic work different from standard attitudinal and behavioral insights?
So when you think about typical indexes, so how does an attitude index versus another attitude, there's two important ways that this differs. One is that because we're doing this in the context of a data mining exercise using regression analysis, what you're looking at is identifying things that matter, holding constant everything else. So you can pull out the independent effect. That's an important difference because you could have two items when you look, for example, if you're looking in our interface and you see two items that over-index, so two attitudes that over-index. It might be that one is important and the other one isn't. They simply correlate one another. It might be that neither of them is actually driving anything, that they're both being driven by something else that matters more. The second way that it's different is that this is allowing the data to speak to you and tell you what you should be looking at. If you're looking at cars, it's a pretty fair bet that if you're an American car manufacturer, that you want to be looking for people who like American cars. That's obvious. But there are going to be other things that are not obvious, and the data help take you there.
Next question. Are there categories that are more amenable to this type of analysis?
Yeah, as we saw in the brand slide, there are some categories that seem to do better than others. Clearly, shows and visual media tend to perform extremely well. The key thing, though, is that it works better for virtually everything. I don't think that there was a category where there was less than a twofold increase in predictive power.